All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is, Doug said, I'm Mike Kelly, and I direct the Centre for Public Health Excellence at NICE. Now, NICE is an organisation that's been in the business of translating evidence into clinical guidelines and technology appraisals since 1999. And in 2005, NICE acquired a role to deal with public health. Now, the brief I was given today was to talk about value and efficiency, but I'm going to orient my talk as I lead on public health to some of the issues which have arisen over the last 6 or 7 years as we've developed an approach to trying to understand how best to do the economics which will support the decision-making in public health. Perhaps by way of background, I should also say that the public health portfolio at NICE has ranged across efforts at the primary prevention of disease, efforts at health improvement, health protection, some aspects of immunization, vaccination programs, as well as covering the obvious related to the major killers associated with tobacco, alcohol, exercise, and obesity. Now, quite interestingly, 2 years before I'd moved to NICE in 2005, we were in the middle of the Wanless inquiry. Wanless was asked by the then Prime Minister to do an analysis of the future of public health in England. And for that, the organisation I was working for, called the Health Development Agency, were asked to make an assessment of the best way to develop health economics for public health. And I published a paper with colleagues from LSE and Aberdeen in which we argued that NICE's approach of the quality adjusted life year of using cost-utility analysis was entirely inadequate for the purposes of doing public health economics. And we argued instead for cost-consequence analysis. I say that because you'll find very little mention in what I'm about to say related to cost-consequence analysis. Because although the argument that this different type of analysis is significant for public health, there are some interesting reasons for also doing cost-utility analysis, and I'll say more of that in a moment. Now, the methods that we use to do our public health work, as with all the methods that NICE use, are published and updated on a regular basis. The most recent update of the public health work was done in 2009, and we're due to publish and are in the middle of preparing for publication of a new edition in April next year. Now, NICE's approach to looking at economic questions in public health, I'll document next. Now, first of all, the methodological challenges of assessing the cost-effectiveness of public health interventions have been well documented. I wasn't the only person to venture into this field and argue that the complexities of the time horizon involved, in other words, the return on a typical public health investment, might be 10, 15, 20 years across the whole life course of an individual or across the lifespan of a population. That the complexities of the intervention make unravelling cause and effect extremely difficult, as well as the fact that there's precious little by way of good cost data to begin with. In fact, when we started our economic analyses at NICE in 2005, we discovered that public health was essentially a cost-free zone. There was a widespread belief, and it was a belief rather than being scientifically validated, a widespread belief that prevention must be better than cure and must be more cost-effective. But back in 2005, when we began to look for empirical evidence to support that belief, we found precious little. So in the absence of an established approach to public health economics, we've deployed a range of different economic methods, making it difficult to compare, in fact, different public health interventions. So if you look at our portfolio of public health work, you'll see that in some areas we focused on the quality adjusted life year as the best and most appropriate way to do it. Elsewhere, we've taken a different type of approach. But there is actually a significant body of work that does use the cost utility, the quality adjusted life year approach, which I'll be describing in a moment. We use a standard set of methods in the organisation as a whole to assess cost effectiveness, the main one being cost utility analysis. which considers in very broad terms, the quality of life that someone will experience, as well as the extra life they will gain as a result of intervening, doing the particular intervention. And at the beginning of our work in public health, that's exactly where we went. For public health interventions, the perspective we usually have adopted is of thinking about costs and benefits to the National Health Service or to the public sector more broadly. Now, that's not always the most helpful way to think about a public health intervention and its costs or its benefits. And there are two different problems. The first is the benefits may accrue across the population to individuals or to firms, to communities, in ways which fall outside of that public sector approach. So there is a limitation, if you like, if you begin in that perspective or in that way. But the other problem, which is of more immediate and practical difficulty, and one to which there is no simple answer, is that even if your costs and benefits are deployed across different parts of the public sector, plotting where costs occur, say they might occur in the criminal justice system, whereas the benefits might accrue in the healthcare system, is not easy to do. Or at least there isn't an easy and simple metric that one can go to from the Treasury or elsewhere to find it. And some of our interventions have had precisely that quality. Some of the things we've done have, for example, been interventions in the education sector where we're anticipating benefits in the healthcare sector and things of that sort. Second, the costs of lost production due to illness or incapacity are routinely not included. And that's been part of the paradigm, so to speak, of health economics that's come down to us from the early pioneers of the discipline, Alan Williams and others. The time horizon that's chosen is chosen to ensure that all important costs and effects are captured, in most cases a lifetime horizon, with an annual discount rate of 3.5% applied to both costs and benefits. And that's an interesting one when you apply that in public health. And of course, we have to undertake sensitivity analysis to handle the parameters of uncertainty that arise. Now, within NICE, as probably everyone in the room knows, where the quality adjusted life year, the QALY, comes out at £20,000 or less, that's considered to be a cost-effective use of resources and a good way to deploy resources at the national level. And that's been the sort of benchmark which has operated across NICE since the late 1990s. Interventions that come in with a figure of between 20 and 30,000 might be considered to be cost-effective if certain other conditions are satisfied. And I say certain other conditions are satisfied, this isn't a matter of turning a handle and a number coming out. The advisory committees, the independent advisory committees that review the evidence and help NICE make the decisions will then weigh up certain other factors that may or may not be relevant. We normally don't recommend interventions if they cost more than £30,000 a QALY, other than for certain end-of-life treatments which are well defined, unless a strong case can be made that it is an effective use of NHS resources. So in fact, there's never really been an absolute threshold. There's always been a degree of latitude which committees have been able to apply. But broadly speaking, they're the kinds of values which we look to. And of course, in 2005, when we began our public health work, thinking about the very first two appraisals we did, considered the cost-effectiveness of brief interventions in primary care, relating, 1, to smoking cessation, and 2, to the promotion of physical activity. They were the first two things which ministers asked us to look at, and they were the first one we put through the system. We considered the effectiveness evidence, and there was quite a lot of that in both of those cases, but there wasn't a huge amount of economic data for us to look at, a story that's been repeated over the last 7 years. But I labour the point slightly because, of course, as we sat down to consider the results of all of this work, prior to making recommendations, the figures which were in our minds were pretty much those of the £20,000 to £30,000. And that is usually represented on a graph that looks something like that, with the green box being where we would normally say yes, that sort of brownie box where there might be some debate, and the red box where it would be a no, except, as I said, in the case of certain end-of-life treatments. Now, it's not very clear, I think, on the screen there, but there are some X's dotted about in the green box. And that indicates the kinds of values which we began to see in public health. And I'd like you just to imagine the scenario. We were sat in a committee room. The Public Health Interventions Advisory Committee were all sitting around the table. We'd heard from the reviewers of the evidence who'd considered the effectiveness of this stuff relating to physical activity and smoking. Then the economists had their moment, and they prepared a PowerPoint slide, and I was waiting. This was a kind of moment of truth, because do bear in mind, up to that point, we had really little or no idea, about the sorts of values that might pop out, expecting it to somewhere, and would we have a difficult decision either side of the threshold, as our colleagues in the Technology Appraisals Committee routinely did. But what happened was the first slide went up, and the value on it, I think, was 76 quid, 76 pounds. And the next one that went up was 160 something. Now, bear in mind, we were expecting something close to 20,000. It was quanta different. My initial reaction was that I thought the economists had calculated it inaccurately. And I asked them to go away and check whether they got the decimals in the right place. But they had, and they were the values which came out. Now, actually, those first two turned out to be among the lowest quality values that we saw. But it's a story that has repeated itself over the 35 public health things that we've looked at, more or less, where the quality values, at least, are extraordinarily beneficial, where the value for money of this type of approach is borne out. And I've got some figures to show you in a moment. And for me, at least, this has been one of the really big stories of the last 5 or 6 years at NICE, has been the demonstration empirically of the fact that, using this method at least, public health interventions are very good value for money and a good use of the Exchequer's taxpayers' pound. Something, incidentally, I've stood in front of at least 4 committees in Parliament, 2 select committees on health and a couple of other committees, one in the House of Lords, and reiterated this message about the value for money of public health interventions. And I've been met variously with incredulity and another question, well, why doesn't government do something about it? Now, when government says that to you, that's a rather odd sort of experience. You are the government, or at least you are Parliament, or committees that are in a position to critique government. But nevertheless, it's a message that's not perhaps got through quite as quickly as we might have hoped. Now, these are some of the values from those first interventions, with the median cost per QALY, the ranges there specified, brief interventions, only 5 minutes. Now, what's quite important here, and this is one of the critical differences with our NICE's clinical work, when you talk about a public health intervention, as you can see, something as simple as a brief intervention actually means at least 3 things we've got on the first 3. Brief interventions lasting only 5 minutes, a brief intervention 5 minutes plus NRT, a brief intervention for 5 minutes plus self-help. If you then factor into that, who does the brief intervention? Is it a nurse, a doctor, some kind of healthcare assistant? You begin to see that building up the cost base and then demonstrating the effectiveness becomes a much more nuanced thing than one simple pharmacological technology might be. So mostly we're talking about ranges across a variety of different types of interventions that can be nuanced and done in different sorts of ways. So you have to actually, of course, treat these values with some caution. But given where they fall, it's quite important to note that the value for money thing still seems pretty strong. I think it's also important to note that very few studies that we were able to look at, and fewer still economic studies, told us anything about health equity here and about the difference in costs and cost benefits, therefore, of doing this with a population where it's harder to produce a result. In other words, populations that are more difficult to reach, populations where the habitual aspects of smoking are more deeply entrenched, where therefore the costs of doing the work will be higher, and therefore the benefits rather different. There's very little in the literature that helps you unravel that. And we've had to do some quite nifty, I think, footwork to try and unpick that question. The fact is, when you do unpick it, it's still good value for money. It doesn't leap you over the 20,000, 30,000 threshold, and indeed doesn't really get anywhere near it. So what's interesting there, although there is a health inequalities issue or health equity issue here, it still plays out in favour of the intervention and in favour of intervening in all population groups, and indeed putting perhaps more effort in those groups where the need is greatest. But we're facing another problem now, which is the return on investment question. Because, of course, the QALY and its associated activity was originally worked out, I think, when Alan Williams and his team were beavering away on this in the late 60s, early 70s in Exeter and then in York. What they were dealing with, what they were trying to grapple with, is the question of resource allocation at national level. But local decision makers, local commissioners want something rather different, which is to say, well, okay, it's good value for money for the taxpayer's pound, but is it good value for money in the deployment of my resources here in Westminster or in wherever they're dealing with, which population group they're dealing with? So what we need is something that takes us beyond the QALY to a model that gives us an idea of return on investment at local level, to understand how people who have to allocate resources at local level use them, what the short, the medium and long-term returns are likely to be. And here the difficulty is that many public health interventions carry a very long return. It's quite some years sometimes before you begin to see a return on investment in economic terms at least. And we need to calculate for them returns and health gains. And in fact, in April next year, or March next year, we will be publishing our first major pilot on doing return on investment at local level using tobacco as the case in point. And interestingly, this takes us back to using cost-consequence analysis as the way of, or at least one of the ways of beginning to build a picture up of how to do the costs and benefits and return on investment at local level. But all of this, I think, needs to carry quite a number of health warnings. Although the general picture is one of cost effectiveness and the empirical evidence about all of this seems to me at least to be the case is well made. Nevertheless, you always need to have some caveats, I think, and at a meeting like this, it's important to share those with you. Our watchword at NICE, and certainly in the public health team, is that the evidence very seldom speaks for itself. It always requires some form of interpretation. And it's that inferential, both inductive and deductive process that we have to engage in our committees that gets us to the point where we can turn evidence into recommendations. Now, what's quite interesting is that there are some very well-defined scientific protocols, the platform of evidence-based medicine at large, for those methods of scientific interpretation, how you do the statistics, the power calculations, all that kind of thing. But the methods for understanding the processes of inference, the judgments which people make, which the scientists make in relation to the evidence, as they make these economic assessments indeed, as they build their economic models, it seems to me, are far less well articulated. It's as if we've got a kind of lopsided approach here in which we've got one side of the equation, the sort of things that's in the Cochrane handbooks and all of that sort of thing, is very well developed and is very tightly defined and is very, very important. But the judgmental processes, where it spills over into, say, clinical judgment or economic judgment or judgments based on social behaviour, psychological judgments, are far less well understood and articulated. And what we are trying to develop now at NICE, what we're building towards, we're trying to develop a method, a typology for understanding these judgmental processes that take us in addition to, not instead of, in addition to those things that are already well defined. And as a preliminary on that, we've begun to develop a threefold classification. First of all, where there are, if you like, empirical matters of fact, the effect size of a trial or something of that sort. Second, there is a range of techniques, including the hierarchy of evidence, including a whole range of things very familiar in the evidence-based medicine platform, which we start off by assuming by definition they're true, that at the hierarchy of evidence, at the top of the hierarchy, those studies are the ones where bias has been minimized. And we take that as a working assumption. That's another type of knowledge that we use. But there's a range of other stuff where we have to move beyond those protocols. And that arises, for us at least, in public health, where we look at a spectrum in the population of multiple pathologies which exist at population level, and indeed at individual level too. It's a very common experience for me to walk into a room full of doctors and then to say, well, you know, the NICE guidance is really great, but I never ever see a patient that corresponds to the NICE guidance. And that's because our guidance, by and large, deals with single pathologies, single disease entities, or single parts of disease entities, or single parts of a clinical pathway. And to some extent, that's also true of our public health work. We look at smoking. We tend to deal with that separately from our work on obesity. We deal with that separately from our work on drug misuse or something like that. And how you handle those spectrums of pathologies at individual and multiple pathologies, individual and social level, and the way that judgmental process builds in is where we're focusing a fair bit of effort, and I hope to be able to come back perhaps next year and tell you where we've got to. Anyway, I'm going to conclude on that point. Some of the references of the work that we've done where we've tried to describe the challenges, both of the economics. That last paper is the publication of the economics paper in the Journal of Public Health out this month, and a range of other papers in which we've explored the challenges of taking an evidence-based medicine platform and applying it across a public health arena. I'll stop there, Doug.
I'm a GP with some public health background. I was just wondering, the 20,000 cutoff, that's been there for a while. How did that come about, and is that going to change in the near future?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that we're frequently asked. It was put in place originally on the basis of calculations assessment done by Alan Williams and his team in York. As a rough and ready measure of what society was willing to pay in terms of the returns that you would get for the input for health improvement, for a technology or whatever. But you're right, that's been there for a long time. And people have frequently said to us, well, you know, we've had inflation, we've had this, we've had that. In fact, the argument is that keeping it as a single threshold, we've got a point of reference over time. The quality calculation is not really affected by change in money values externally, or at least they shouldn't be if you're doing the economic calculations properly. But above all else, it gives us a constant reference point across time and across technologies. And if we were on a moving target, it would be much more tricky, I think, for our committees to put it in place. Currently, the leads for the economics in our technology appraisals team are going through a review process, and this is something, again, that will be considered, and the pros and cons of changing that will be analysed. But for the time being, we stay where we are because it gives us, as I say, a reference point across time. Quite interestingly, I said at the beginning of my talk, or what I think was quite interesting, I came into NICE with a view that the QALY was not the optimal way to do public health work. And I was persuaded by Tony Cullier, who was there at the beginning in health economics, and interestingly had been my economics tutor when I was an undergraduate, so he had a kind of bit of traction on me. And he said, Mike, well, look, you know, you're right, but at the same time, just think what it would be like if you were able to draw out the comparisons using the same value system that we use in clinical medicine in public health. And of course, he was absolutely right. So when those first small values came out, although there are kind of intellectual arguments that one might make against it, nevertheless, it's very powerful in making the case of public health.
Colin Feek from New Zealand. I see the press answer the question about breast screening this morning, which I asked you last time. Archie Cochrane said a dollar at the top of the cliff is the same as a dollar at the bottom of the cliff, and I think that's the real raison d'etre for actually getting a similar methodology, because it's what you get for it. I would argue what some of the cases you put up there aren't public health interventions, they're personal health interventions. We can argue about that. What I would be really interested in is applying QALYs to breast screening, colorectal screening, to health education in terms of obesity, say, in terms of alcohol prevention and all those sorts of things, and where they stack up.
Okay, well, in the case of the UK, or at least England anyway, because our work only covers England, not the whole of the United Kingdom, on the first two, on screening and the two screening, both types of screening, all types of screening, that's the province of the National Screening Committee. And by convention, NICE hasn't looked at screening interventions nor applied its cost-effectiveness approach to it. We did, in a related area, immunisation is the same actually, that's the province of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation rather than NICE, but we did get a referral from ministers to consider the cost-effectiveness of improving immunisation systems, not to evaluate particular vaccines against other vaccines, but systems of delivery and record keeping and all that kind of thing. And we did apply the cost-benefit type of approach to it, did apply a cost-utility approach, and found it to be, if you get it right, to be very good value for money. On the other two you mentioned, health education and work on alcohol, we've done those, or at least we've done with respect to prevention and misuse of alcohol. Whether you are looking, and we applied the metric across everything from big societal-wide policy changes, such as the setting of a minimum price per unit of alcohol, through to examining other aspects of pricing, availability and licensing, through to an analysis of the effects of the brief interventions done in primary care and A&E departments on alcohol misuse using the audit questionnaire, I think. The results were absolutely in favour of them. So that you get a big go with that. We've done discrete aspects of health education in relation to obesity and others, and it all comes down with my rather ill-drawn graph there. That's because I'm not very good at doing PowerPoint, or at least graphs in PowerPoint. But it gets to the point that they all come down in that sort of cluster of value for money stuff. So it's possible to do it. It's well worth doing because it demonstrates, I think, the not just the effectiveness of what we're doing, but the cost effectiveness of what we're doing in these arenas. I'd like to go on and do stuff on immunisation and screening too, but who knows? That's a matter for ministers, not for me.